Since first appearing on any tier list of relevance, Lee Sin's been stuck in Targon. Now, his partner in crime has changed a few times from Zed to Zoe to... that's really the end of the line unless we get into very niche tournament lineups that was looking to pair Lee Sin with a traditionally Zoe secondary deck. But he's had a good run, he mastered the trick of Crescendum into Eye of the Dragon, but now Crescendum sucks, and it might be time for Lee Sin to make a grand exodus from Targon. But Boulevard, what about Akshan Lee Sin? I didn't forget. I said what I said. But now Viktor Lee might be the first time that we are looking at a mainstream Lee Sin deck that can outperform the Targon variant. So what makes this deck so special? Why is this the thing that is going to free Lee Sin from Targon? That's the beauty of it, baby. It's not a Lee Sin deck. Because one of the things that you may have noticed about the regional combination of Piltover and Zaun and Ionia is that there's no way to give Lee Sin Overwhelm. Obviously, Ambush is a great finisher, but it's not one that synergizes with Lee Sin. Lee doesn't care about having Elusive. He's going to deal the damage anyway because of the Dragon's Rage. So instead of that one-shot Lee Sin style that we're used to with Overwhelm, we're going to be slowly chipping away at our opponent and finishing them off with a large ambushed augment unit, ideally Viktor, maybe Ballistic Bot. That's sort of the bread and butter, right? That's the obvious thing. We can scrim through the top end of the deck really quickly, actually, as these are all recognizable Ionia combo staples. Deep Meditation, Deny, Concussive Palm, Station Archivist makes sense in a deck that's trying to play a lot of spells. For the most part, when things get really interesting is when we get to the low end, actually, into these 2-mana cards, because this is the first time I've seen Calculated Creations in anything that I would call a competitive deck. Now, here are 2 things that you need to know about me. Number 1 is that I absolutely love Ballistic Bot. I was very sad when this card was cut from Draven Ezreal. And number 2 is that I did not like Eye of the Dragon in Karma Ezreal. In fact, I've never really liked Eye outside of Targon, since that's the only region where you get these cheap, self-replacing, proactive cards like Pale Cascade and Guiding Touch. That said, I do really like Eye in this deck, and part of that reason is Ballistic Bot. Now, Ballistic Bot didn't really work out in Karma Ezreal for a number of reasons, the main one being that it didn't synergize with either Karma or Ezreal, at least while Ezreal was unleveled, and therefore was really just there to facilitate Eye of the Dragon. In this deck, Ballistic Bot is the core. It is what ties everything together. Not only is it the cheap activator for your Eye of the Dragon, which of course is going to be created cards to level up the Viktor, but also spells to level up the Lee Sin, which solves an issue that I have historically had with non-Targon Lee Sin, which is that it's very hard to level them up. Even the Akshan version could run into situations where the proactive combat tricks really either put a hamper on your mana base or were just played at awkward times, and you could have difficulty actually leveling the Lee Sin in order to get for those overwhelm finishers. Again, this deck does not care about leveling Lee Sin, but it is nice. Again, another issue that I've had with something like Viktor is his place in Piltover and Zaun. And I've spoken on this before, but just to reiterate, my main gripe with Viktor is that Piltover and Zaun's created cards are generally very cheap and therefore low impact. It doesn't feel like a big payoff that I'm playing 0-mana Daring Poros. Now, we run Calculated Creations not only because Ballistic Bot is good, but because Neandroid can be a win condition. So while normally making a 0-mana Ignition is pretty low power on the scale of powerful things that you can do in Legends of Runeterra, once you have out 3 or more augment units, which is to say the Bot, the Viktor, and the Neandroid, then all of a sudden you are paying more than just 0 mana for 1 damage. You're getting 2, 3, sometimes even 4 damage out of just that 1 ignition, and Poro Cannon runs in a similar vein. And of course, this is all on top of the Hex Core being generated each turn, which alongside a Ballistic Bot is your eye proc right there, just the ignition and the Hex Core. While I can be a little bit difficult to activate on turn 3, we're not really in a meta where you're scrambling to get eye off as soon as possible and consistently generate it every turn. You will almost always have access to eye on defensive turns, and with Viktor and Bot active, you can easily get off eye every turn for just 1 mana. So back to Lee Sin really quickly, because I did kind of hype him up in the preamble. Elusives are not particularly popular right now as a main deck tool for many decks, making the Challenger on top of the damage that you do a pivotal part of your overall Neandroid ambush strategy in case you do run into a Daring Poro deck or two. Lee Sin being able to pull that singular elusive that your opponent is likely to have out of the way, phenomenal. Now, I can't do much about Quicksand, but counterplay to the counterplay is scarce, alright? That's just a hallmark of Legends of Runeterra. But since Lee Sin is not pivotal to your strategy, since he is just something to pull these other units out of the way to make room for your ambush, you don't actually have to really pump resources into protecting him as often. You get to play with that barrier a little bit looser. You don't have to use deny to save him so much. You're really looking to protect the Viktor in that case when we're talking about actual win conditions for the deck. So now you might be thinking, well, this all sounds well and good, but what if I don't like the sound of a utility Lee Sin? Is there anything that I can do about that to make him more of a win condition? And the answer is no, there isn't, but you can take him out of the deck for Vi. Now, we've already seen a solid performance from a Vi Viktor Ionia list out of 4LW, so we know that this deck is proven. Now, Vi is more of a threat in her own right since she's another ambush target. She doesn't require a spell for Challenger, which can be relevant because your sort of immediately and always available spells like Ignition and Hexcore are slow speed, and sometimes you don't want to give your opponent a priority sequence before jumping right into combat. Maybe you don't have a burst speed spell immediately available. It is one advantage that Vi is going to get over Lee. What Lee brings to the table over Vi is longevity. The barrier and the kick make it so that Lee is much more consistent as a challenger if you're going to be playing the long game, on top of the fact that it doesn't matter when you draw Lee Sin. Vi you have to sort of have already immediately available to pump up the attack on it, because it's going to take 2 or 3 turns after you draw Vi in order to get her to 10 attack. Lee will always be what Lee is. But there have been times where the longevity of Lee Sin just does not matter, because that is the advantage that he has. The barrier, the kick, he's very safe when he goes in for the challenges. Vi is probably only going to get to challenge 2 or 3 units before she ends up dying. In my experience with this deck, I've only need to challenge things 1 or 2 times before the game ended. So in this specific instance, the longevity of Lee Sin just doesn't feel like it matters in most of the games that I've played so far. Now, another thing that this deck does change is cutting Eye of the Dragon for Pharaoh's Financer. Eye of the Dragon is not mandatory in this deck. It is very much a meta call. And I do like Eye for the chip damage that it provides, just playing aggressively with the Dragonlings. But again, this is personal choice. And when we look at the things that you can get off of Pharaoh's Financer, I like it more in a Vi version than a Lee Sin version, because Dawn and Dusk, Dragon's Rage, and Give It All are all win conditions that you can manifest that specifically work with Vi, not with Lee Sin. Yes, you can still get Viktor or a Giant Ballistic Bot to work with any of these, but I think that Vi is going to be a more consistent, less frail option than, say, a Ballistic Bot in terms of comboing with one of these endgame cards. Now, Vi versus Lee Sin is preference. Players are still figuring it out, because again, there is still that problem of if you draw Vi too late, then she is not going to do what Lee Sin does. But I think you know which one you like more. Do you like Lee Sin or do you like Vi more? Definitely do not run both of them. Do not cut Viktor for Lee Sin to run a Lee Sin Vi deck. That's not what I'm recommending here. Viktor's mandatory. Vi and Lee Sin, you can figure out which one you like. I don't really recommend a split, but you can do what you want because their champion spells aren't super great, and lately players have really been trending towards this 3 champion style because they really like having access to playing more units rather than having champion spells in hand. So if anything, I'd say 2 Vi, 1 Lee, but that's just it. So as we start to wrap things up here, I've shown you 2 different variants to throw away some LP with. Isn't that fun? Now, this is far from the hardest deck that I've highlighted, but you do have to be very deliberate. The order in which you do things matters a lot, and if you're just going through the motions, it can be easy to miss. I would say that this is a great deck to sort of get you into the competitive scene, play a little bit outside the box. It's not difficult by any means, but you do have to pay attention to what you're doing. Because one of the more common examples I've run into for this trade-off is power versus mana efficiency. In this example, my Viktor is at 6 out of 7 on the level up. If I play the Hex Core first, then my Neandroid is only 2 mana, but I'll miss out on the Augment trigger for it. Similarly, I can play my Neandroid and then get the Augment trigger so that it comes down in situations of 1 mana versus 1 damage, which matters a lot when you're going for the kill and you need to represent something like Deny. Another thing to keep in mind is that if Viktor dies, you can no longer cast the Hex Core for a free Augment trigger. So if you think your opponent can kill Viktor, it might be more beneficial to start off the turn with the Hex Core before you do something else like play Lee Sin, so that you guarantee the Augment triggers rather than get a little bit greedy depending on the situation and use the Hex Core to give Lee Sin the challenger. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to show you all the cool stuff this deck can do, but I am a very big fan of the Viktor decks. Not necessarily Viktor himself, but just the cards that you get to put in a shell around him. And again, not a difficult deck. This is a great starter if you're looking to get into a competitive scene or just want to try something a little bit outside the meta. But again, you need to be very concise in what you are doing. It's easy to just tunnel vision and sort of play the Hex Core as the first card every turn, and while you want to do that most often because you like to have that information of what keyword Viktor got, there are situations where you're going to want to sandbag that until a little bit later. Now, I myself have only played the Lee Sin version. If you've played the Vi version, you love it, you want to sell me on it, please tell me about it in the comments below. I would love to have a reason to get off my Lee Sin, because I have a prismatic Lee. I don't have a prismatic Vi, and that's the deal breaker for me right now. But any reason's a good reason. So, if you guys like this video, you made it this far, go ahead and like it, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon, ring the notifications, get notified when we put up videos and all this cool stuff. I'll have another couple of videos for you next week. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I have been Boulevard for GiantSlayerTV. Till next time.